Good morning, my English 1101 Fearless class. Thank you so much for all of your submissions for the first essay. I'm currently reading through them, really thrilled to be sort of seeing all of the things you've taken in from our essays that we've looked at, the ways that you're constructing details and placing yourself as outsiders and moving sort of in a clear organization towards this idea of becoming an insider. And so I'm really having a great time reading through and getting you feedback on your essays. Please look for the remainder of your feedback by mid to late week, but thank you so much. I'm getting through them as quickly as I can. I'm again really excited to be reading through them. So thank you so much for that. Thank you also to Artica, who has designed this fantastic banner for our class landing page for this week. And again, I'm going to alternate between the two that I received for extra credit. So thank you so much. It's great to see you all here. So this week is going to be very exciting. I know you sort of are just off the heels of turning in your first paper, but I've actually designed the class so that you do most of the sort of heft of writing in the first sort of 5 weeks to 6 weeks so that you have most of the drafting and writing done by the time we end class, because I really want to foreground drafting processes and feedback, and I don't want to end class with sort of leaving you feedback after class has ended, but rather that you get feedback along the way and that sort of by the end of class you already have completed your essay and have already incorporated feedback so that you sort of have a fuller idea of your writing and its growth throughout the semester. So if you wouldn't mind, please click on Unit 4. A few brief notes from last week. Part of the exercise that I asked you to engage with was to think about on dumpster diving after you've read through the full PDF of the essay. Lars Einar does some really interesting things with detail and evidence, and so I wanted you to sort of see and maybe emulate the different kinds of evidence that he uses. Observations, he uses sort of personal experiences or encounters, he defines words, he exaggerates, hyperbolizes, and all of these things you pointed out as we were going through. And so I wanted you to black those out so that we could see, the bare bones of the essay, what he started working with, and then where he started to develop those details, where he started to fill in and bring those details to life. What do those details look like? For those of you who wrote at the beginning of class that your goal is to sort of think about how to improve writing or to increase writing without feeling like you're becoming redundant, this was an exercise to help you start to understand and see where a writer where sort of the basic structure of the writing begins and where the details come to life. And so thank you to all of you who've done that. Miriam, you identify different ways, safely eating out of dumpsters. How does that happen? And Einar's essay is so fascinating. It moves not only from this sort of examination and how-to guide for readers on the one level of, how to navigate sort of the homeless life, but on another level, he's actually making a sort of social commentary. As we throw things away, it becomes at the end an investigation into to we the consumers who throw these things away. He humanizes this idea of a dumpster diver, and how does he do that? It's really interesting that the sort of levels of the dumpster kind of mimic the sort of levels of society as he's moving from sort of the upper crust to sort of the lower levels of society as well. And so he sort of organizes his essay in that same kind of hierarchy from the top of the dumpster to the bottom of the dumpster. Thank you, Kayla, to pointing out, I know over time you said has learned the safest and cleanest ways to eat. And so he explains those things to us as outsiders. A little bit irked, he talks about a conversation he has about someone who can't quite, who asks him, well, do you think these crackers are really safe to eat? And why, he says, why can't he evaluate the conditions of the crackers himself? So showing us a little bit of critique in the way that he's detailing his life, his lifestyle. Thank you, Drew. You kind of had a different take here in terms of, I like that you sort of made it so that we could still read the text. So maybe that was a better idea than to completely black out the text, but I like that we can kind of still read underneath here. You said the surface, the different details that are required to get the main point across here. So different words. Such shops often get prank orders called bogus. So he actually uses in his details specific jargon, specific language that he knows as an insider these pizza places might use. Danessa, you mentioned that Einar talks about sort of the different things that people can eat and shouldn't eat from dumpsters. So, I avoid game, poultry, pork, and egg-based food. So those are all kind of details. And then he talks about, I seldom have the means to cook what I find. So some sort of insights. The evidence includes insight into his own daily habits of sort of cooking or consuming food. Eliana, thank you so much for pointing out the sort of insight of Einar's brain. We're sort of examining what his sort of, you said, details experience in becoming a scavenger as well as the thought process. That's really important, this idea of the thought process behind what these dumpster divers think. Again, he's not speaking for all the dumpster divers, but he's using his own specific experience in a way to kind of humanize this experience rather than sort of grouping all people who are sort of homeless together as one. He says at first the new scavenger is filled with disgust and self-loathing. And so it's really interesting to have that kind of insight into that particular habit, that particular lifestyle. Thank you, Davian, for continuing this idea of the sort of self-reflection that Einar goes through in terms of, the ethos and the ethics of going through dumpsters. Is it okay to go through someone's personal bills, correspondence, and other documents, diaries? And he talks about that sort of that consideration that maybe someone doesn't think a dumpster diver has, but this sort of, the etiquette that goes with dumpster diving and the sort of thought process behind investigating those kinds of documents is really astute. And again, thank you for all of these wonderful comments. I'm just trying to hit a few highlights here. Zena, thank you so much for mentioning the dog Lisbeth. Einar brings in this, I would consider her the enabling character. Lisbeth is the dog that Einar, that accompanies Einar throughout this essay and in most of his dumpster diving activities. And so what kind of perspective does having the dog with him provide for us, the reader? What kinds of evidence and what kinds of material does that enabling figure provide or suggest as we're reading through? So I hope you enjoyed this essay and kind of understood it as yet another example and sort of iteration, vastly different from Sedaris and Keisner, of how one is an outsider, of how one examines oneself as an outsider, and then sort of at the end here critiques we who find ourselves to be the insiders as rat race millions. So thank you for reading this essay so carefully. This week in Unit 4, we're going to be thinking a lot about practicing writing as a process involving inquiry, invention, composing, and some feedback from responses, from my responses and peer responses. We're also going to be thinking about rhetorical situations. So what in particular makes a piece of writing responsible to a particular audience and a particular purpose. And we're going to be doing this by thinking about it in terms of a cultural analysis. So up until this point, you've been reflecting upon your own experience and culture. And what kind of experience does that yield? Does that yield a sort of response to gender? Does it yield a response to a particular kind of race or ethnicity, particular organization, particular age, particular sex or identification? And so all of these autoethnographies are going to raise at their very center some sort of cultural issue, some sort of cultural investigation about a specific cultural group. As I mentioned at the outset of this course, we're going to be moving not only from an investigation and a sort of research of the self, but we're going to be opening up that research to include things that are beyond us. So, for example, pairing our research with a primary source, and then later pairing our investigation with the primary source and our own selves out into a secondary source investigation until we finally get to the end of this class and sort of these ideas will work seamlessly into a kind of final mini research project. And so this week, what we're really going to be focusing on is what a primary source is and how that primary source, we can locate a primary source to help bolster the very topic that we're sort of deciding upon, that we're thinking about and considering in our autoethnographies of essay number 1. I'm jumping around just a little bit today because I wanted to present to you the next cultural essay, or the next essay number 2, that is going to be due not this week, but the following Friday, which is the 23rd of September. And so just a brief overview of what this cultural analysis essay is. I've selected this painting from COD, has an online exhibit right now, and I've included the link on the front here, but some really fascinating artwork by COD students. This one is specifically by Blair Douglas, spray paint on canvas, and I thought this was sort of an excellent image, considered a primary source, something that's created by someone at a particular moment in time. And so the cultural analysis essay is going to be the next thing that we're going to be working on over the next couple weeks. What is the cultural analysis essay? Well, it's going to draw from your autoethnography. It's going to draw from a topic that you raised in your autoethnography. And so when you get under the cultural analysis essay, you can click right here to read the full prompt. Please carefully read through this following prompt. You'll choose the cultural issue in relationship to your beliefs, values, or passions that arose from your autoethnography and course readings. In Essay 2, I'm asking you to bridge the gap between your personal experience and/or the knowledge of that cultural issue expressed in Essay 1 with a primary source outside of your immediate experience. The primary source can include artifacts, records, film, photographs, autobiographies, journals, interviews, songs, poems, short stories, sculptures, buildings, etc. So primary sources are something that we have to spend just a brief moment examining. This is the definition from COD's library. A primary source is a first-hand or eyewitness account. It presents actual evidence of an event without any analysis or interpretation. It can include diaries, letters, legal or court documents, etc. The things that I listed on our prompt. And so again, a primary source is made or crafted at a particular moment in time, nearest the sort of first-hand or eyewitness account. So if you have a particular song or a particular piece of artwork that represents some of the cultural issues that you discussed in your autoethnography, please use those. Secondary source material is different because it actually interprets the primary source material. And so if you want to watch this brief video that kind of uses the civil rights movement as a way to investigate the kinds of primary sources that someone might use to talk about civil rights versus the secondary sources that exist. Again, secondary sources would be things that interpret primary sources. So in other words, a journal article in a scientific magazine, a textbook, a piece of nonfiction. These are all things that would be considered secondary sources that interpret the primary sources. And so this week, we're really just focusing on primary sources. When you find a primary source, you're going to ask how and in what way is this primary source in conversation with your cultural issue or experience. You might choose to address what the primary source illuminates about our understanding of the cultural issue. Does the primary source agree with your beliefs about the cultural issue? Why or why not? And so again, think about the following questions. I'm giving you kind of a specific set of questions to think about as you compose this paper. Clearly define the cultural issue as you see it. Again, that might be a little difficult. Maybe in your autoethnography, you're thinking, I don't know what my cultural issue was. So go back and think about what was at stake in your cultural issue. If we're talking about Lara Zeiner, the cultural issue is sort of consumption and different sort of socioeconomic statuses. If we're talking about David Sedaris, what's at the center is what is culture and what is language, and learning language. What is that process? So articulate your position about this particular cultural issue that existed in your autoethnography and analyze how and in what ways this primary source that you discover this week is in conversation with your cultural issue. For example, a student wanting to explore the cultural issue of Latinx immigrant culture and language may discuss a recorded interview of a Hispanic writer. That's just one example. Really, the sky is the limit here, and feel free to kind of use Google, use any of the resources around you. If you have photographs, you can use a photograph. If you have an interview or a conversation with someone that you'd like to replicate, you can use that. If you have a piece of artwork you created, feel free to use that. If there's a piece of clothing that has some sort of significance as a primary source for your subject, please feel free to use that. Also email me if you have questions or need any guidance. Please try to explore and write about your cultural object on your own. If you have any trouble, I do have, reach out to me and/or examine one possibility for this project under the student sample essay. The student sample essay can be found at the very bottom of our folder for the cultural analysis essay 2. Please also note that I've included a section on introductions and conclusions best practices. I give you some brief tips on how to write an introduction, how to begin, and then also give you 2 examples from the beginnings of our essays from last week. I also include the conclusion, some brief tips and tricks, and some other excerpts.